It's the fifth video in the series, and Jesus spends 40 days with Satan, wild beasts, and angels. Let's examine Mark chapter 1, verses 12 and 13. This is verse 12, from the English Standard Version of the Bible. The Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. If you watched the previous video, you remember that Jesus was just baptized by John, and the Spirit descended on him like a dove, and a voice from heaven declared, "You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased." Mark then tells his readers that the Spirit, presumably the very same Spirit, drove Jesus out into the wilderness. When did the Spirit do this? Immediately. This is Mark's second use of immediately in 3 verses. Immediately, after Jesus came up out of the water, the heavens were torn, the Spirit descended, and God announced his approval of his Son. Then the Spirit immediately drove Jesus out into the wilderness. Why does it matter that it happened immediately? Have you ever gone camping? Have you ever gone spur-of-the-moment camping without any opportunity to gather your things? Whatever happens to Jesus in the wilderness happens without prior planning and preparation. Right after the baptism, the Spirit drove or compelled Jesus out into the wilderness. But wait, John the Baptist conducted his ministry in the wilderness along the Jordan. We read that in verses 4 and 5. Wasn't Jesus already in the wilderness? Yes, but there's a big difference between being in a wilderness area with a bunch of other people and leaving the crowd and going off alone. The wilderness often represents danger in the Old Testament. There is security in numbers. Villages and towns tend to have walls, gates, and guards. Most people have family, friends, and neighbors at home. But to be alone in the wilderness is to face danger, seemingly without support. Let's carry on and look at verse 13. And he was in the wilderness 40 days, being tempted by Satan. And he was with the wild animals, and the angels were ministering to him. So this immediate camping trip, with zero preparation or supplies, was not just an overnighter. Jesus was in the wilderness, in a place that typifies danger, for 40 days. The number 40 occurs many times in the Old Testament, and Mark's original audience would presumably know that. How can we assume that? Because Mark doesn't explain it. He seems to count on his audience catching his allusion to historic 40s from the story of God's people. In the Old Testament, the number 40 symbolizes a complete time of testing, judgment, purification, or preparation. Here are a few examples. The flood in Noah's day lasted 40 days and 40 nights. Moses spent 40 days and 40 nights on Mount Sinai before delivering the law. The Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years after the exodus from Egypt before reaching the Promised Land. The prophet Elijah spent 40 days traveling to Horeb through the wilderness and was cared for by an angel. We've seen Elijah-like imagery already in Mark's Gospel, with the wardrobe and mission of John the Baptist. So Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days, but he wasn't alone. We're told he was being tempted by Satan. Mark doesn't tell us how, or why, or with what frequency Satan tempted Jesus. Matthew and Luke, on the other hand, offer details of the dialogue between Jesus and Satan. It seems like the contents of the temptation are less important to Mark than the fact of the temptation, and Satan wasn't the only one there with Jesus. Mark tells his readers that Jesus was with the wild animals. What an interesting way to say that. Not, there were wild animals in the wilderness. Not, he feared that he might encounter wild animals. Not, wild animals were stalking him. Rather, he was with the wild animals. Just like the wilderness represents danger, so typically do wild animals. But apparently not to Jesus. Despite being there with Satan and wild animals, representing both spiritual and physical danger, Jesus doesn't seem to suffer any harm. And who else, are we told, was there? The angels were ministering to him. So, this Jesus, whom both Mark and God himself called the Son of God, goes straight from his baptism into a dangerous wilderness place populated by wild animals and Satan. The perfect picture of peril. But he's not alone. He's ministered to by angels. What is an angel? The word angel means messenger. So the angels Mark mentions are messengers from God to his Son in a perilous place and predicament. What does Mark say was the conclusion of this 40-day period of testing and temptation? Well, that's the wildest thing about this part of the story. Unlike Matthew and Luke, Mark doesn't tell us what happened. Mark leaves us with, the angels were ministering to him. It's as though he thought this was all his readers would need to be able to assume that everything turned out okay. Because from there, Mark takes us to the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. Next time, we'll hear the Gospel of God according to Jesus Christ in Mark chapter 1, verses 14 and 15. Thank you for watching SoWhatScripture. Please subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends.